Okay, merci beaucoup. So thank you very much. And what I would like to propose is to discuss from a global and international perspective the question of the digital transformation of education. We heard it earlier, we must not focus on the past 2 years, COVID, but at the same time, we cannot discuss the digital transformation of education without looking back at what was an unprecedented disruption of formal education. Not that there was no prior experience of digital transformation and efforts in many countries. On the contrary, and we know from the last 2 years that countries that invested in strengthening public digital education systems fared well during the period of educational disruption. But I will be focusing on the COVID period. And this is a map of, in dark blue, the school closures, the scale in April of 2020. That's about 190 countries in which educational systems were completely closed, affecting an estimated 1.4 billion students from pre-primary to secondary level, some 90% of the world's student population. We also know, on the next slide, we also know that the duration of these closures varied considerably from country to country and region to region. In some countries, if we take Papua New Guinea, the closures were as short as 6 weeks. A country like Mali, we had 17 weeks. But in others, schools were closed, and many here you will see from the Latin American region, but also Asia. But here from Latin America, Venezuela, Panama, Mexico, we could add Brazil, Honduras, over 50 weeks of continuous closure. So what we do, what we also saw over the last 2 years is that educational systems and schools in particular were quick to close with the emergence of the pandemic, but it was much slower and much more difficult to reopen as different variants of COVID were unfolding. But on the next slide, we can see that the response to school closures was invariably the deployment of remote learning in an attempt to ensure at least the continuity of learning. And globally, 9 out of 10 countries deployed some form of remote learning during that period. They were combinations of multiple technologies, obviously accounting for the fact that household connectivity at a time of confinement was very unequal. On average, 85% in Europe, but as low as 15% in Africa. So a combination of technologies, and we know that very well from a number of countries in Latin America, but also here in Europe, of using television as a supplement or to reach at least those who are not covered by connectivity. But the main thing that you'll see here is that digital learning and digital remote learning was always, or in most cases, always part of the mix. There's a few exceptions in sub-Saharan Africa where this was not the case. So as a result of this experience, what was once peripheral in policy discussions on education, technology, it was either experimenting in more privileged educational contexts, experimenting new pedagogies, new ways of doing in education, or, on the other hand, trying to reach the unreached in rural settings or those who have not benefited from formal education. What has happened in the last 2 years, there's not one single national, regional, global education policy discussion today that does not deal also with the question of digital education. So really what happened over the last 2 years, it is the largest, longest ed tech deployment that we have ever seen in history. And so on the next slide, what I'd like to suggest is to revisit some of the promises of digital learning against the backdrop of this experience of the last 2 years. And since the start of the pandemic, UNESCO has been examining these promises of EdTech against the reality that we have seen in countries around the world. It's common to hear people, it was very common to hear it at the beginning of the disruption, to hear people refer to it as a global experiment and a global experiment to innovate in digital learning. But it was not an experiment. It was an imposed shock to the systems, and it was an imposed reality, day-to-day reality for learners, for teachers and families, policymakers, for all of us, practically everyone concerned in one way or another with education, for all of us here in this auditorium. So we've been closely observing this historical experience since February, March of 2020, and looking beyond the discourse. And the discourse is very much, on digital learning, is very much about the potential. It's not to discredit the potential, but to look beyond the declared potential of digital learning and to see what actually happened. So we've been trying to understand this global shift from school-based learning to technology-reliant distance learning, and in diverse settings, and as I said, since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, it's not a question of being optimistic or pessimistic or polarizing the debate, but of really trying to understand what happened to see how we can best move forward, and I'll come to that at the end. So yes, the digital did allow continuity of education for many, but not for most. And an objective reading of the evidence over the last 2 years is that this sudden switch to remote digital learning entailed numerous adverse consequences, even if they were unintentional. And this included many: normalizing learning in isolation, at a distance, homogenizing educational experiences. Although we hear a lot about personalization of learning through the digital, there was also a homogenization of the types of educational experiences that were made available during the period of fully remote learning. A deepened reliance on private and often for-profit service providers, and an uncritical acceptance, I would say, that the digital transformation of education is desirable, inevitable, and a pillar of educational resilience. And we've been a little surprised at how strong this narrative remains despite evidence that we see at the global level. And there is a discourse and a narrative around how the shock to the system advanced, allowed us to leapfrog, forced, catapulted education systems, industrial models of education systems into the 21st century. And in many cases, in some cases, we are saying that based on this experience, remote learning based on educational technologies is being positioned as a long-term solution to educational challenges, even as the pandemic winds down. And in several countries, the return to in-person learning has been and remains optional, that students actually have a choice and that they could continue to learn exclusively online. A number of governments have also shifted investments away from schools and teachers, which are the physical and human infrastructure of education, towards digital hardware and software. So the evidence we've been reviewing actually suggests that the education has become, or at least in the first year of the disruption, less accessible, less effective, less engaging when it pivoted from physical spaces entirely to virtual and digitally mediated spaces of learning. And there's other negative impacts that we hear less about. We heard a little bit in the introduction. Issues of censorship, of data extraction, advertising, top-down control, issues that relate to digital transformation of our societies, but also possibly to education. Intimidation, surveillance, issues of who owns learners' and teachers' data and what is done with it. So these are real risks of the digital transformation of education. There's also the fact that digital spaces have had a tendency to push education into a market logic, seeing students as consumers, commodities, ready to buy educational service, buy connectivity, data access in order to access education, but also seeing students and people as beings whose behavioral patterns can be influenced in predictable ways and for different purposes. So the overall analysis is that education in the last 2 years, there has been innovation. Innovation does not always produce the positive results that we would aspire to. And possibly that we are on a dangerous trajectory at odds with the status of education as a human right, as a public endeavor, which is vital to the well-being of learners, to knowledge development, to citizenship, and to social cohesion. So better understanding what happened can allow us to better imagine new approaches and models for technology education in education. Technology must serve our aspirations in education. In the emergency, we saw that education often had to twist and adapt to the logics of technology. But this was a time of emergency and the need for emergency response. Now that we can look back and gain the insights, we need to see how technology needs to adapt to serve our most noble ambitions in education. And it must not limit it or constrain our sense of what is possible. So I'd like to go through some of the promises and actually just look back and compare to what we see, what the evidence tells us in terms of the reality. So on the next slide, the first promise was, and pre-COVID, that educational technologies can expand and improve inclusion. That EdTech has long been positioned as a powerful set of tools to expand the reach of education. When millions of schools around the world shut down in the pandemic at the beginning of 2020, EdTech appeared to be the lifeline to formal education, a solution that would guarantee that learning never stopped. But in fact, and we can, on the next slide, it's not data, but rather images. The evidence actually tells us that most were not reached. Most learners were excluded. Looking here globally at the international picture, and it's a bit the paradox of digital learning, if I'm not mistaken, a term used by the World Bank, to say we have this discourse about expanding reach, yet we know with the limitations of access to connectivity, different dimensions of the digital divide, we're actually excluding almost by design. One of the contradictions, I think, and even at UNESCO in terms of a self-critical appraisal of the last 2 years, we all focused, and we use the slogan, learning never stops. So we focused on those already in the formal education system. Somewhere we abandoned completely those who were not in the system, those who might have been enrolled in non-formal education programs, in literacy programs. Perhaps we had no choice. At the time of confinement, these programs stopped entirely, and only formal education institutions, when well prepared, were able to deliver some kind of remote learning. But if we take just Africa, only 1 in 10 learners was reached by any type of remote learning. That's the estimate. So we could say, I mean, even if unconditional, one could argue it is almost exclusion by design. But because technologies are understood as futures-oriented, superior for learning, they enjoy an elevated status, even if their potential to reach large numbers is actually quite limited, at least in the experience we have had so far. And when we look back at the last 2 years, we also see that there were very few measures to support non-digital, non-technology modes of learning during closure of educational institutions. Another aspect, obviously, is the digital divide. On the next slide, again, just an image for our imagination more than anything else, and the multiple dimensions of the digital divide. People speak in terms of connectivity, or access to connectivity. But even when digital learning was made available, there are important barriers of cost, affordability, and lack of appropriate skills. Taking just cost of hardware, if we take smartphones and affordability of smartphones, the cost of smartphones varies in terms of household income from 4 to 5% of an average monthly income in countries like Botswana, Jamaica, Mexico. 4 or 5% of monthly income is the actual cost of a smartphone. But in others, in Burundi, it's 220% of the household income. In Sierra Leone, it's 600%. The cost of a smartphone is 600% of the monthly income. There's costs of connectivity as well. 1 gigabyte of mobile data, it's about 25 US cents or centimes in Italy, about $5 in Madagascar, about $16 in Yemen, about $25 in Malawi. So the cost seems to increase in an inverse proportion to the level of income of countries. So the burden and the share in terms of the burden that represents in terms of the share of household disposable income. And digital skills, we often talk about the digital skill gap. And an early survey we did at UNESCO actually in 2020 through ministries of education, all levels of development status, but one of the interesting findings that the main barrier that all countries found to the deployment of digital learning was the lack of digital skills. First among parents, and that's important for younger learners because they, in home mediated distance education they need to facilitate, but then teachers, but even among students. And surprisingly, this was regardless of income status. This was the main challenge. But we think of this in terms of really the technical skills. But citing, this is from September 2020, ITU, the International Telecommunications Union report, 2020, indicated that in low and middle income countries, 1/4 of the adults were not aware that it is even possible to access the internet on a mobile phone. So, I mean, beyond the technical skills, even the awareness of what is possible and what one could eventually do. Exclusion also from EdTech while severe globally, also affects women disproportionately. And from certain sources, women in sub-Saharan Africa are 40% less likely to use mobile internet than men, 40% less likely to use, for a variety of reasons, including social and cultural norms, systems of just gender distribution of roles, and that the gender gaps widen at each stage of the mobile internet journey. In other words, from awareness to actually owning a connected device, to actually adopting it, and finally to using it in a productive and meaningful way. So that's the first promise of FTech, if you want, that has long been there in terms of expanding access and reaching, expanding access and improving inclusion. The second, and we can go to the next slide, is the promise of assuring equity. EdTech has long promised to equalize educational opportunity, to give all students, regardless of economic condition, regardless of perhaps ethnicity, residence, geography, an equal chance at a quality education. It's a little bit the logic of the MOOCs at the time, that you can be in some remote and disadvantaged community, but still access the best quality education available. So really, EdTech hailed as a tool that could bring high-quality education to all corners of the globe and de-link education from exclusionary, high-cost institutions. And we heard of the Ivy League universities, producing MOOCs and making those available. But we also know, and we've heard it, and I think it's clearly admitted now on the next slide, that inequality during the last 2 years were supercharged, and supercharged in different ways. And because the shift from complete remote learning shifted from educational institutions to the home, it became completely reliant on family capacity. It was not providing an equal playing field. Actually, schools in particular, as formal educational institutions, are a place where some commonality and some access to equal opportunity is provided. In remote learning, the characteristics of the home became a further factor of inequity in education. So the premise of that promise, the long-standing promise of connectivity that can help equalize access to quality education for underprivileged learners, rests on the premise of the faulty premise that connectivity itself is equal. And we know that that's not the case. So as we said, on the next slide, just to give images again, physical schools, the social and the physical space of the school that helps to guarantee modes and models of education are reasonably similar for students from different backgrounds. And therefore, it is a contribution to greater equality for those from more disadvantaged. But remote digital models, entirely remote, those models actually become more unequal. Virtual learning was also, or is, also not a placeless learning. The corporal bodies of students did not disappear, and for many students, the physical environment of the home made technology-dependent modes of distance learning difficult, if not impossible. Even to turn on your video in a home that you might not like to expose publicly. The conditions of your home, your living conditions, and even the difficult and unsafe family or neighborhood environment that you might be living in. And the school, after all, the physical space and social space of the school remained a sanctuary for students, particularly for those from difficult and potentially unsafe home environments. In terms of disability, we speak of equity. Of the 150 countries that were surveyed, only half reported that they had adopted some measures to facilitate learning for those with disabilities during the fully remote learning. So again, a factor of inequity. Next slide, a third promise of EdTech was technology can strengthen engagement, achievement, and outcomes. A central promise was that it would be more engaging, more effective. We heard of gaming, more fun, more relevant learning that would ultimately improve the educational outcomes. And that by removing the restrictions, the physical and restrictions of location, of when and where of learning, technology would allow young people to spend more time on formal learning and accelerate academic progress. And what we have seen, next slide, again an image just to portray, during the periods of confinement, since so many other activities, when we were all confined for different periods of time, other activities were not possible. So it was plausible to imagine that a retreat into into study through remote learning would be one of the effects. But what we have seen that it is less frequent and less sustained learning than one would have expected in traditional educational physical environments. Where EdTech did show promise, it was when it was used in schools and in educational institutions, but not when it served as the singular interface for education. So here our focus, just to be clear, is really on the initial period of fully remote digital learning. We've also seen, next slide, more dropout. The figures are very hard to come by at the international level, and they're only beginning to emerge, but that the longer the reliance on EdTech, the greater the rates of drop-off or fall-off or disengagement from formal education. It also reminds us a little bit of what we know about the experience of MOOCs. MOOCs have very high dropout rates, despite the promise that they put forward. And others quit in more privileged settings, may have quit public education and went, moved to homeschooling. We heard about, the learning pods where privileged families would come together, recruit a teacher, and actually do a kind of alternative homeschooling during these periods of confinement. The next promise is that EdTech would open new horizons for learning. EdTech promised new, exciting horizons for education that would be less encumbered by physical and resource limitations, that it would break the factory model. And we heard a lot of this discourse at the beginning of 2022. Finally, a massive shock to our 19th century industrial factory models of education, and that we would be facilitating more diverse, personalized, effective learning, and pulling us by force actually into the digital age. But the visions, that more triumphant discourse that we heard very early in March, April of 2020 subsided. And it's true that it subsided quite quickly. We can go to the next slide, or even the next. There was the idea that, EdTech did allow continuity of study, curricular study, guided through academic, guiding through academic content in specific subjects. But many discovered that the experiences were rather flat and monotonous, a kind of routine of going through shared file systems, moving through automated learning content. That's what we often refer to as the personalized learning. Checking updates on corporate platforms, enduring long video calls and classes. We suffer from that even at work. So, and actually, a lot of sort of behaviorist pedagogical thinking, and not more modern, constructivist approaches. The pedagogical choices of teachers were often also dictated by what was possible technologically. There was also, and this is the image here of the vendor machine, a growth of for-profit education. This was a concern before COVID and the response to the COVID disruptions, but there has been a rapid growth of for-profit education providers, companies, applications, and tools, and that these could, looking further, undermine, again, the status of education as a human right, as a public good. On the next slide, just to indicate here the rise in 1 year during the first year of the pandemic, from February 2020 to February 2021, the number of students using Google Classroom tripled. A huge number of students became reliant on actually a small handful of educational platforms. So we spoke about leaving the industrial factory model, but in fact we were coming to a kind of global factory model with a few set models. And finally, on the next slide, issues, as I had mentioned earlier, around surveillance, and the risks associated with engaging with virtual spaces for younger people. But even pedagogically, we need spaces where it is safe to venture ideas, where it is safe to think and change your opinion and change your point of view, to even play around with your identity and take on different roles. But with the ease of data capture, with storage and surveillance in digital spaces, it's more risky to experiment. And a rich educational experience should be one where we experiment, where we can try out new things, where we're curious, we attempt, and we learn, and we grow intellectually. Next on the educational promises is resilience, and we hear a lot about this. Next slide, just for the title. That technologies, educational technologies, will strengthen the resilience of our education systems. They'll make them shock-proof, future-proof. But again, just for a touch of realism, according to World Bank data, fewer than 50% of people in sub-Saharan Africa have reliable access to electricity. So, EdTech can only be resilient if we have batteries that can be charged. So we know that the issues are beyond the education silo. The International Telecommunications Union estimated the cost of connecting all people in the world. This is our ambition, and a noble ambition, of universal connectivity. The cost of connecting all people over 10 years old to the internet is more than $400 billion. That's the estimated cost. It does not undermine that it is a legitimate aspiration and a direction to go. But that's what it represents in terms of the reality of, and if one adds the cost of hardware, it's even more. The risks also, and this is just one interesting figure because we don't hear it much. There's a range of threats to digital learning that can undercut its capacity to be reliant and to make our systems more resilient. So here's one figure from Microsoft's global tracking of malware. Microsoft's global tracking of malware indicates that education was the most targeted sector during the pandemic, and by a significant margin. Just between February and March of 2022, so just a couple of months ago, Microsoft documented almost 7 million attacks on devices used for education. And that's more than 80% of all attacks. That's something for us to consider. I mean, we usually think in terms of national security in times of conflict, but that education is actually most targeted by malware attacks. Next slide. It's not, to be fair, it's not entirely a promise of education technology, but somewhere to say that, if we move to the digital, away from paper, print, books, somewhere it's more environmentally friendly. But we'll come to it. On the next slide, you'll see, and this is from a technology research firm, IDC, just the unprecedented increase in the sales of Chromebooks in 2022. So just in absolute terms, in 2019, pre-pandemic, 17 million Chromebooks sold in the world. In 2020, it almost doubled, almost 32 million, 37 million last year. And with this, next slide, comes the issue of electronic waste. Experts call it actually the world's fastest growing type of waste, electronic waste. 53 million metric tons, according to the UN Global E-Waste Monitoring Report. This was 2019. 53 million metric tons of digital waste, which is the equivalent, and that's the image. It's the equivalent of the weight of all the adults in Europe, if we put us on a scale. That's what we're produced in 2019, was produced as waste. Not directly connected, but we can go to the next slide. Issues of child work in any situation of economic crisis, and the COVID disruption was also added to this. And we know that as schools closed, some children, instead of being in education in classrooms, were actually earning a livelihood because of increased economic pressures. But some of these children were earning livelihoods scavenging for e-waste or working in mines to source the raw materials to produce the hardware that powers education technology. We're not blaming it all on education technology, but there's some interesting links in terms of the environment, in terms of effects on poverty, and we know that discussions on digital learning and digitization of education is part of a wider digitization of all aspects of our lives, and therefore difficult to disentangle. But to take one figure, over 250,000 Congolese mining for cobalt, 40,000 were estimated to be children. Now, this is not because of a deficiency of remote learning, but an interesting indirect connection between child work, cobalt, technology, and distance learning. Last, perhaps, on, or next to last, on health. Next slide. Pre-pandemic, there was not much discussion about digital learning and health. It was considered not to have. There were maybe some discussions on screen time and duration of screen time, but not too much. But basically considered to be neutral. And actually, some concerns about health were almost considered a little bit old-fashioned. I mean, but medical associations have quickly discovered that the switch to educational technology does have negative impact on physical health, on mental health. Increases in screen time, both for education and for leisure, increase pain, muscles, eating disorders. The loss of touch with the real world, human-to-human contact, and which was part of our confinement and part of our retreat into technology during that period of confinement, including for education. That young people had difficulty finding substitutes for the socialization, the in-person, the unstructured play, the physical interactions that one has in in-person schooling and education. So this immersion, and we've seen it in multiple surveys in terms of stress, anxiety among teachers and among students in many cases. The World Health Organization and many medical groups advised at some point during the pandemic that the health risks of opening schools while COVID was still subsiding was a better option than the health risks associated with closed schools. And then issues around even pre-primary education, virtual, when the World Health Organization actually discourages any screen time below certain very young ages. No screen time at all is the recommendation of the World Health Organization for young children. A final word, we can move to the next slide, or just on the right to education before just a few concluding statements. One of the probably less explicit but fundamental transformations we have experienced over the last 2 years with the closures of educational institutions, with this massive deployment of remote learning and most of that on the digital, is that it has kind of blurred our understandings of what we mean by the right to education. And I'm thinking here in particular for compulsory education. What does compulsory mean if you are fully remote digitally? What does free mean? What is accessible? What education? What is available education? And in some cases, it could be argued that online education has emerged as an option to avoid structural overhauls and investments in repairing educational institutions, equipment, and maybe repair, for institutions and locations that fall short of health and safety standards. So there is this paradoxical relationship. We did discover for schooling that first, schools are much more than education. They are nutrition, they are protection, it's socialization, social civic learning, and well-being. So the physical and the social space of schools in particular are more than education. That education is more than academic learning and what we can do remotely. It is also all the learning that is done with others in interaction, and that learning, after all, is rooted in social interaction. So, next slide, next or last. So how do we go basically beyond a technology solutionist mindset? And again, it's not about pessimistic versus optimistic and a polarized kind of debate. There is great potential in technology and digital technology for education, but the digital transformation of education must be steered. We must chart a course for it. A lot of the discourse, from my position at UNESCO in 2020, that we were hearing at the international development level, we must accelerate the digitization of education. And the question is not accelerate or not accelerate. The question is steer it in the direction that we want to go. There must be more space. We must reclaim innovation. Innovation is not only related to technology. Technology obviously fosters and emerges from innovation. But innovation in education cannot only be tied, and there is much space for innovation in curriculum, in pedagogy, in the management of educational institutions that are not linked to technology. But it is, just to recall, I mean, education is our most humanistic project. I mean, it is preparing young people to be full, responsible, productive, meaningful actors, contributors to our societies and to the multiple challenges that we have, and that we should not be offloading some of that to technology. So we need to chart this new way, prioritize the best interest of teachers, students, and schools, reposition for schools as central multi-purpose social institutions. They are the foundation of a larger educational ecosystem. They have a special place and role. And then to strengthen the alliance between education technology, and connectivity issues. Most recently, and I'll end with this and a mention of what's coming next at the international level, in December of last year, there was the adoption of a global declaration on connectivity for education, which actually helps to chart the way forward just around 3 simple principles, and then there's some operational recommendations. But a first principle is that any innovation, digital innovation in education must center the most marginalized. If it works with more marginalized communities, it's a much more socially just way of scaling out. We usually start in digital innovation education, usually we start with the more privileged and hope it will trickle down and have an effect. So centering the most marginalized, whatever marginalization might look like in all our societies. Second, to strengthen public digital education systems with free, open, quality-assured resources. So yes, private sector has a role to play in helping to build platforms, but learning content must be open, accessible to all, free, and public and quality assured by national or local educational authorities. And thirdly, that we must strengthen the capacity. We often speak of just digital skills, but actually digital learning, there are multiple possibilities that we're not exploiting. Very often we hear digitizing education is like replicating educational processes that we have to the virtual world. But there is space to innovate pedagogically. And so we need to strengthen the capacities of the educational actors to innovate and make the most use of this. A last word to say, so what's coming next at the international level is the UN Secretary General is organizing a summit in New York on transforming education, the Transforming Education Summit. Heads of states of all countries have been invited to look at the bigger picture questions around education. Longer term, both retrospectively, long-term issues that beyond the COVID response, but also looking longer term, thinking in terms of governing for the future. And to think of what are directions of transformation of our educational systems, what are levers for innovation at scale. And some of that discussion obviously has to do with digital learning and transformation, obviously together with teachers and educators, issues of skills for life and work, issues of financing of education. But one of the important tracks is the digital learning and transformation. So thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.